didn't happen to me, but I happened to a family that is or was extremely anti-paranormal or supernatural things. They never believed stuff, and to this day, they still try and think of a rational explanation as to what happened. They live in a rural area in a big old house, and one night they heard knocking on the door. When they went to the door, instead of opening it, they looked out the top window and didn't see anyone. A little while later, more knocks on the front door, but also their back door and side door. This was the middle of the night, so they assumed some people were going to break in. Makes sense since someone knocked on their door earlier in the day and no one answered. They grabbed their guns and stayed at the ready in case somebody came in. Instead of somebody breaking down the door, more knocks were heard. This time, also on the walls. The husband mustered up enough courage to finally look outside, and what he saw didn't make sense. Wolves. Wolves, not coyotes, were circling around the old house. This also happened in the Southern Plains area, where no wolves live. Sure, maybe coyotes, cougars, or even a bear or two, but wolves? As I've said, this husband and wife still don't know exactly how wolves managed to knock on their doors and walls, but they are determined it wasn't supernatural. I don't know. If that happened to me, I would be a little on the skeptical side. My mom is from a really small town in Mexico, and they have the craziest stories from elves to witches to all other sorts of creatures. I would always hear about witches playing at night and turning into balls of fire and bouncing around, but I was always kind of skeptical. Well, one night, my husband took me to a place in Hidalgo, Mexico. It's like a remote area where there's a huge crater in the ground, and it's only about 20 minutes away from my mom's town. It was around 10 or 11 p.m., and of course, nobody was around. It was just me and my husband, and I was able to clearly see these balls of fire bounce from different sides of the crater, literally like they were playing. There's a tiny little town at the bottom of the crater, and they don't even have electricity, so it wasn't lights or anything like that. I honestly went not expecting to see anything, and I don't know if the witches saw us or not, but they weren't trying to hide what they were doing. These balls of fire can appear anywhere, not just this specific crater, because I've heard so many stories like this from people in Mexico, including my dad who's from another town, but it's more common to see them in the hills, mountains or craters where they can bounce around. I also saw a fairy, and that was here in the U.S., but that's another story. Back in either the summer of 91 or 92, because it was when I hung out with a different group of kids. We lived and played out on the street with 3 of the kids lived, and another one's backyard ran up against it. On this street, all the houses were kind of old, and there was one empty lot next to a spooky old house. Nothing ever happened with that house either. It was just spooky. The woods ran along and down from the west sides of the houses and ran up against the Trinity River. On the other side of the river was what used to be Carswell Air Force Base. We accidentally trespassed there once. Had 3 soldiers in full camo holding guns aimed at my chest. But that's a different story. We played in those woods, swam in the river, and generally got up to no good in those woods. There were always rumors that some satanic cult did stuff down in those woods, and we were told to stay away. But being young teens, we didn't listen. One of the days we'd been running around and exploring the woods, maybe hunting squirrels with a BB gun and pellets, I don't know, until we all got a weird vibe. Something didn't feel right. We decided to call it off early and made our way up out of the woods. We went into an empty lot and looked out over the woods, across the river, and at the base. That's when we heard it. This god-awful scream that sounded like something out of a monster movie. It was half a monstrous roar, and yet it had a human quality to it. But it was loud. Oh my God, how it was loud. It chilled me to the bone. It chills me to the bone now, 28 years later. I don't know what in the hell we heard, but we all heard it. It was the first time in my life that I used profanity. That fork of the Trinity River was fed in part by the spillway off of Lake Worth. Decades ago, there were stories of the Goatman out that way. Silly stuff, but stories were told nonetheless. With it being a military facility, it would not surprise me if some weird experiments were done, and somehow a creature had escaped and was on the loose. I wish I could plug something up to my brain so I could convey that sound. I think it might have been a Bigfoot though, because later on in life, I would look up sounds on YouTube, and the closest I can describe it was what I had heard from a Bigfoot call if you look up Bigfoot sounds on YouTube. This was in Fairview, Tennessee in 2004. I was on my family's property that was a couple of acres and walking around picking up trash, trying to keep the land clean. It's a very overcast day in the fall, probably late September, early October, and out of nowhere, I hear this total cacophony of noise coming from the tree line to the back of our property. I turn my head, expecting to see some of our neighbors' cattle coming through a hole in the fencing or something. Instead, I see a massive bird. To this day, the image of this bird is seared into my mind. The thing looked like a golden eagle and had to be about 10 feet tall from head to toe, with a wingspan of 20-ish feet. I hit puberty pretty early, and I was already 6 feet tall by this point. I just couldn't believe the sight of this bird. I could have easily ridden on it. It had came through the forest and had attempted to perch itself on a bundle of trees that it had gripped in its talons. But the trees were all pretty wimpy, and it dwarfed them easily. After 2 of the trees snapped, the bird quickly flapped its wings and took off to the sky. It shot straight upward in a way that I've never seen a bird do before, and soared almost instantly above the clouds. I sat there for another hour hoping it would come back, but nobody in my family believed me. The thing I think most about those days were, in the weeks leading up to my sighting, we had been finding a ton of dead deer and cows in the area that were nearly picked clean. Most of them had had their ribs broken inwards and large gashes in their backs and sides. All I've been able to think about is how it had to have been a massive bird hunting experience. My family still doesn't believe me, nor did anyone in the area except for a trucker that claims he saw the same thing flying in the night sky near Brentwood, Tennessee, a few months earlier during the summer. But I like to think of that bird as the Lord of the Sky, the absolute apex aerial lifeform. Around sundown, my dog loves to sit at the window and watch, noticing any movement out the window. Whenever she does see something, she'll growl, and I'll always look to myself to see if she's growling at plants moving or something legitimate. This particular night, I noticed something emerge from a bush diagonally across the street. It stopped in the middle of the street, and I got my mom to also see it before it continued out of our view. It looked to be around 1.5 feet tall. It wasn't wide or long, but appeared stout. It may sound silly, but I would describe it as the silhouette of a gnome. It could have been a child, but if it were, then the child would have to be wearing a heavy jacket because of how it appeared to be so stout. But this was in August, 80-degree weather. My brother suggested it was a black fox that we know lives around here, which is a good suggestion, but the way it had a bounce in its step was something only a bipedal could make. Imagine a child of sort ham-footing around, excited to get where they're going. It was like that. My dad has told me lots of stories about things he has seen as a kid when he lived in Mexico. One night, he woke up around 2 to 3 in the morning because he had to use the bathroom. Back then, there wasn't a bathroom in the house he lived in, so he had to go outside. He woke up one of his older brothers to go outside with him because he was scared. So they went outside. My dad went behind a bush, and his brother was out there nearby to keep him company, telling him to hurry up since he wanted to go back to sleep. Then, my dad sees this tiny figure in the distance. He said it looked like a doll or something, but it had red, glowing eyes, and as it got closer, it got bigger in size. My dad was terrified and called his brother to come over to where he was by the bush. My dad whispered to his brother and tells him what he sees. So they both look at the doll creature, when all of a sudden, it runs off to the side into some other bushes, but really, really fast. My dad and his brother both look at each other and run back inside. When I was a kid, I often went to my grandparents' house with my mother. The house was in France, right by a forest and a few abandoned fields full of grass, right at the limit of the village. I was like 8 years old at the time, and I used to ride my little bicycle around the house. But I always felt weird when I was behind the house, on the forest side, without being able to explain it. The weird thing is that one day I was riding around the house as usual, passing my mother's parked car, and I saw a little man inside the car watching me. What was weird is that I remember having seen him first, but not really paying attention to him, as if it were normal. I can still remember his face nowadays, nearly 30 years later. He was probably about 50 centimeters high, and had a mustache and a weird grin, so I didn't pay attention to it, and made another lap around the house, and I saw him again, looking at me. Except that this time, I totally panicked and ran inside, calling for my mom and grandma, telling them about what I had seen. After insisting a bit, they came down to check, and of course, there was no one. Oh, and I went back there a few years ago. Grandparents long dead, so the house is abandoned, but that forest feels even more hostile than it did when I was a kid. When I was a kid, maybe 7, I went to a place that was a very big subject for a lot of paranormal activity. My Aunt Shelley. I won't disclose much, but we're from the Northeast, and like way up north. My Aunt Shelley was obsessed with fairies. She had dolls, which I can give the story on some other day. But anyway, that moved around without her touching them. Paintings, murals, rugs, coffee mugs. Everything fairies. And black grapes. Anyway, I was in her fairy garden, and I noticed a very tiny set of garden furniture. Like what I could describe as a cast iron glass top garden table and 4 chairs. I'm really curious about it, so I lean in closer and move away a vine of the black grapes, so she grew so much of them, and behind it, there are 5 fairies. Tiny, sickly thin, stark white with stringy hair, like that stuff that grows under corn husks, and no faces. I watched them all sit and eat the 5th fairy in a grotesque way. I'm not sure what happened after that. I think my mom came and picked me up and brought me inside for dinner. I can't remember. I was so focused on the tiny bones cracking, the ribs sticking out of the chest, and the sticky black blood. It's been like 14 to 15 years. I was camping in an area with a lot of Bigfoot sightings. I was almost asleep when my mom calls my name. She says, "I hear Bigfoot." Now, we had lived in the mountains for many years. We had a small ranch with horses, chickens, pigs, etc. I've been hunting my whole life and have basically grown up in the mountains. I have never heard anything like this. It was loud. Louder than an elk bugle. All the dogs in the area were going crazy. For over an hour, we listened to it. Sometimes it sounded like it was getting really close, but then it would go away. It was moving all over the place. Really freaky. So, I live in Oregon, and the woods are basically unavoidable here. One time while camping with a friend, we went out hiking. While hiking, we heard a loud, deeply inhuman scream down near the creek. This basically scared us both shitless, and we made like a 1-mile run within 5 minutes. By the way, it didn't sound like an elk, goat, or any kind of animal. It sounded almost like a really weird noise. I don't know how else to describe it. Also, the campground was Trout Creek, and it's kind of close to Sweet Home, Oregon. Beautiful place, by the way, to go check out. I'm going back this year, and I'll be sure to record anything strange, and I'll hike the same trail I did last year. Also, any possible explanation for what I could have heard. When I was younger, I would make a game of and practice of calming my mind and making no noise as I walked through the forest. I was out for a hike, and a good 6 miles from the nearest road, walking along an old game trail in the Rockies. I heard a stream up ahead of me, reached it, and began walking along the stream, hoping to find a nice hole with some fish. A few minutes later, I was coming around a big old tree at a bend and saw a small, child-sized figure in weird greenish clothing sitting on a rock with its back towards me. This surprised me, and the instant I saw it, it turned and saw me. I raised my hand and I said, "Hi." While I was doing that, I received a spiritual communication from it. Mainly shock and surprise that I had approached so closely without it noticing. Also, I got the impression that it lived someplace near and frequented the stream. Heard a rustling in the bushes to my right. Glanced over and back, and it was gone. The other one. My parents had bought a home in the same general area of the above encounter, although 20 years later. I was visiting and decided to sleep downstairs, which at that point I don't think anyone had ever spent any time in. The house was just a few years old. As is my habit, I set up the wards around the room before going to sleep. Around 1 a.m., I snapped awake to see a green ball of light come through the south wall about 3 feet up from the floor and stop. Got the same sort of instantaneous form of spiritual communication. It used that particular route to get to where it was going. Lived underground and had been using the same route so long it was not thinking it would encounter anything, much less than a human, and was completely surprised to encounter me in that location, stopping in disbelief. I've seen some weird, paranormal, supernatural things since I was a very small child, so I never shut it out, because I just assume that there's a lot of stuff out there that we know nothing about. When I was in my 20s, I was dating a guy who loved to camp, and so did I. He decided to take me to visit some friends that lived on 150 acres in the Daniel Boone Forest in Kentucky. After the long drive, we arrived and met our hosts, a really lovely couple. They lived in a log cabin that the guy had built with no electricity, and water tapped in from a creek on the property that was so pure you can drink straight out of it. We were walking around the property, checking out the amazing gardens that our house hostess had been growing for the past 20-some years. The property was incredible. There was a cave up at the top of the crest in the forest filled with hieroglyphs. The flowers and fruit trees and vegetables were gigantic. Everything was lush and gorgeous. Their house was set in a cleared area, surrounded by woods and bordered by the creek. As our hostess showed us the gardens, we were standing at the tree line, and I kept seeing a gigantic insect out of the corner of my eye. I'm not afraid of bees, but This thing was huge, so I finally turned to look, and I didn't believe what I was seeing. A tiny man hovered at my shoulder level. He had wings that beat very fast and sounded exactly like a hummingbird's wings. He had black hair, pointed ears, and his clothing was green and almost looked like leaves. I stared for what seemed like minutes but was only seconds, watching him and not really understanding what I was seeing. He put his hands up beside his ears and blew a raspberry at me, smiled mischievously, and flew off lightning fast. I turned back to our hostess, and she saw my face, which must have been a total shock. She smiled so sweetly and said, "Did you see one of the fairies?" She then went on to tell us that the land was filled with them, and that at night we sat on the front porch and watched tiny lights in the grass floating up and coming back down. My boyfriend and I slept in our tent outside, and I woke up early the next morning and walked around the dew-soaked yard. There were at least 3 perfect fairy rings in the grass. I have been to a lot of special places, but that one is the most magical and beautiful I have ever seen. I don't know the proper name for it, but it was a big black dog wolf-looking thing. It was not a coyote or a dog. It was not a normal animal with mange or anything of the sort. It was about half the size of a car. I saw this creature when I was a child living at my parents' home. Behind us was just woods for about a quarter of a mile. There used to be a small frosted window in the bathroom, which was partially underground. So the window was just at the level of ground, if that makes sense. It was very late at night. I have insomnia, so I wake up 4 to 5 times per night. Anyway, through the window, I saw some type of glowing yellow something, and then movement. I thought it may be a raccoon or something, but it creeped me out. I went back into my room, and the cat was in the windowsill, growling and hissing. At that point, I thought it was another cat outside. I was terrified, but I went to the corner of the window and carefully peeled back the curtain just a sliver. What I saw chilled me to the core. It was some type of massive dog-wolf creature. It had a huge hump on its back and long, greasy-looking fur. As it moved around the yard, it kept tripping the motion sensor light, but it was too far away to see clearly. It looked like it was eating apples that had fallen off of our tree. But the most terrifying part was that it walked on its 2 back legs. I felt my blood turn to ice, and I was totally frozen in fear. I couldn't look away. I stared at it until it made its way back into the woods. I was only about 10 or maybe 11 when this happened. Not me, but my sister. This happened when we were kids. She's probably 4 to 5 years old at the time, and me about 6. We're over at our grandparents' house in the city, and their backyard's full of trees and is sloping down to a river. One late afternoon, we were playing house at the back with just the 2 of us. I walked away for a little bit since, if I remember correctly, I was trying to get something for our play. And when I went back to my sister, she told me she just talked to 2 small people with wings, but that they already flew away. I asked her what they looked like and where these small people were before they flew. And she just told me that 3 to 5 of them landed on the space near the stove and that she wasn't scared. She told me they were nice. Flash forward to this year, I remember asking her about it again just so I can confirm that it did happen and she wasn't bullshitting me then. She said she saw them with her own eyes and that she wouldn't lie about it. Low-key regret is that I wasn't able to meet them myself. I live in a very rural area. My house is literally in the woods. The woods are well known for being haunted. Anyway, one night, I was outside letting my dogs out. The woods directly behind my house. There's a few homes down the street, but nobody enters each other's property, and there's no children here. My dogs were barking at the woods, and it sounded like someone was running toward us. I called for my husband to get a flashlight, as hikers tend to end up lost and coming through our property because they see our lights. There wasn't anybody there. An hour or so later, I'm sitting in the living room. It's about 11 p.m. at night. I had my porch light on and the door ajar because it was so hot that night. My dog starts barking and I go outside and this little kid came out of nowhere on a bicycle. I was really concerned, to be honest. This kid looked to be no older than 10. I screamed for him to stop. I wanted to make sure that he wasn't lost. There's campsites in the woods because it is a national park, but it's literally miles away from my home. I was scared that he got lost by himself. He didn't stop. He ended up riding around the block and down the hill and stared at me. He had a gray hoodie on, and his eyes were dark. I panicked and came back inside, locked the doors. I felt sick. I believe after talking with another neighbor who has an even scarier experience than I do, said that it was a black-eyed child. I don't leave my door open no more at night. Nobody believes me besides my neighbors and my husband. First of all, I'm a pagan, which is pretty much an earth-based religion. In a nutshell, I worship the earth. When I was first getting into paganism, or rather Wicca at the time, I had met a group of people who held a gathering on Saturday evenings. It was actually a lot of fun. We would talk about our different paths, joke around. Eventually, the talk turned into how some of them had heard and or seen dragons. At this point, they lost me. I played along with them, but I'm thinking these people are just making stuff up. One guy claimed he lived in the country and would hear roars of the dragons coming from within the woods. I'm thinking it was more likely a bobcat or an angry redneck who lost his beer. For some reason, I looked up in the sky and not a cloud in sight. The sun still up and the vast blue canvas. I saw what looked like a large snake moving strangely in the sky. Being a huge believer in UFOs, I pointed this out to everyone. It was writhing and wiggling, just like a serpent high in the sky. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Granted, this was before everyone had a phone with a camera, and all I have is a memory. Once I pointed it out, everyone looks up and all agree. Oh, that's a dragon. They know we're talking about them. Now, I'm not saying it was a dragon, but it was definitely a UFO in the sense of the definition. I haven't seen anything like it since, and in all my years in paganism, I still have yet to see any actual dragons.